Listen, brother, you're sitting at your kitchen table in the middle of tax season, staring at a W-2, and it hits you. The government just took a massive bite out of your year. You worked late nights, gave up weekends, carried stress for 12 straight months, and for 3 or 4 of those months, you were basically working for free just to pay Uncle Sam. That stings. And deep down, you've been trained to accept it. You've been told your whole life that paying taxes is just part of living in a civilized society. Fine. But then you open your phone and see a billionaire paying a lower tax rate than you. You see tech founders, real estate kings, guys living like emperors while showing almost no income to the IRS. And suddenly it feels dirty. It feels rigged. Let me tell you the truth, bro. It is rigged. But not because they're breaking the rules. It's rigged because they're playing a different game with a different rule book than the one you were handed in school. Most people think wealth comes from working hard, earning a big salary, and saving whatever survives after taxes. That sounds responsible. It also keeps people average. The wealthy already know something most people never figure out. Earned income is the most heavily taxed money on the planet. Trying to get rich from a salary is like trying to sprint uphill with bricks on your back. You can do it, but you're making the game 10 times harder than it needs to be. Today, I'm going to break down the exact system the top 1% use to step around the tax machine. It's called buy, borrow, die. And by the time we're done, you're going to understand why your high salary might actually be a trap, and how you can start using the same principles even if you don't have $1 billion yet. We're going to break this into 3 phases and show you how to go from being a tax victim to thinking like a tax strategist. To understand why the rich don't pay taxes the way you do, you first have to understand one simple difference. The way you get paid is completely different from the way they get paid. When you earn a salary, that money gets taxed before it even touches your account. Federal takes a cut, state takes a cut, Social Security takes a cut. Then you get what's left and try to build a life out of the leftovers. That's the W-2 trap, my friend. You trade time for money, and that money gets hit with the highest rates possible. Wealthy people don't trade time for money, they trade money for assets. And that takes us to phase 1, buy. The wealthy don't obsess over income, they obsess over net worth. They take capital and buy appreciating assets. Stocks, real estate, businesses. And here's the detail most people completely miss. When an asset goes up in value, you do not owe taxes on that growth until you sell it. That's called an unrealized gain. If you buy Amazon at $100 and it goes to $1,000, you made $900 on paper. The IRS can't touch that $900 yet. It just sits there, compounding, growing, building momentum year after year. Tax-free. That's why you see headlines about billionaires adding $10 billion to their net worth in 1 year while paying 0 income tax. The wealth is trapped inside assets, not sitting in a checking account as taxable cash. The rich understand that the second you sell, you trigger a taxable event. So what do? They don't sell. They let the snowball roll. Now obviously that raises a question, and it's the right question. If all their wealth is tied up in stocks, buildings, companies, and they never sell, then how do they actually live? How do they buy the mansion, the jet, the groceries, the ridiculous watch collection? If it's all just numbers on paper, where does the spendable money come from? This is where the second phase comes in. And this is where your brain has to rewire itself. Borrow. Most people were raised to believe debt is bad. Debt is dangerous. Debt is slavery. That's how regular people get trapped. But for the wealthy, debt is a tool, a weapon, a tax-free access point to wealth. Instead of selling stock and triggering a giant tax bill, they go to a bank and borrow against their assets. This is often called a securities-backed line of credit. The bank looks at a $10 million portfolio and says, sure, we'll lend you $5 million against it at a low interest rate because you clearly have the collateral. And here's the beautiful part, brother. Loan proceeds are not taxable income. When the bank wires that $5 million into the account, the IRS sees 0 income. Zero. That means they now have millions in spending power without creating a taxable event. By borrowing, on paper, they can look like they make almost nothing. In real life, they live better than anyone you know. And I know what you're thinking. Yeah, but what about the interest? Good question. Yes, they pay interest. But the math still crushes in their favor. Let's say they borrow at 3% or 4% while their portfolio keeps compounding at 8% or 10%. They're still ahead. Their money stays invested, keeps growing, and outpaces the cost of borrowing. That's called positive arbitrage. Sounds fancy. It's simple. They borrow cheap, keep their assets growing faster, and use the bank's money to live. Compare that to your world. You sell your labor, lose 30% to 40% in taxes, and then try to invest whatever scraps survive. They skip the tax hit entirely and keep their capital working around the clock. That's not a small advantage. That changes everything. Then we get to phase 3, die. And yeah, it sounds dark, but this is where the real genius shows up. This is where the game gets finished. Because eventually people ask the obvious question. If they keep borrowing and borrowing, doesn't that debt eventually have to be settled? Yes, but not the way you think. When the wealthy person dies, the heirs inherit the assets. And under current tax law, something incredible happens. The step up in basis. This is the holy grail, bro. This is where decades of tax liability can vanish like smoke. Here's the clean example. Let's say your grandmother bought stock 50 years ago for $10 a share. Today it's worth $500. If she sold before she died, she'd owe capital gains tax on the $490 profit. But if she dies and leaves it to you, the cost basis resets to the current market value. The IRS acts like you bought it at $500. All those built-up gains across 50 years, gone. The tax liability disappears. You can sell that stock the next day for $500 and owe zero capital gains tax. That's not a loophole in the shadows. That's the system working exactly as written. So now you see the full cycle. They buy appreciating assets. They borrow against them to fund their life tax-free. Then they die. The heirs inherit with the stepped-up basis, sell part of the assets if needed, wipe out the debt, and keep the bulk of the wealth intact. Then the cycle starts again. Buy, borrow, die. It's a wealth machine that bypasses the tax pain regular workers live under. That's why wealth inequality keeps expanding. That's why the middle class feels like it's sprinting on a treadmill while the rich look like they're taking a private elevator. The tax code rewards capital and punishes labor. If you work for money, you get squeezed. If your money works for you, you get rewarded. That's the game. Being angry about it won't help you. Understanding it might. Now maybe you're thinking, that's nice for Jeff Bezos, but I can't walk into a bank and borrow 7 figures against my portfolio. True, not yet, but the principles still apply. That's what matters. You don't need $1 billion to start thinking like someone who understands buy, borrow, die. The first shift is mental. You stop thinking like a consumer and start thinking like an investor. You stop prioritizing looking debt-free at all costs and start prioritizing owning appreciating assets. Most people are obsessed with killing all debt. They throw every extra dollar at a low-interest mortgage or a cheap car loan because it makes them feel safe. Sounds smart. Often isn't. By doing that, they lock up liquidity and kill opportunity. A wealthy person is not in a rush to wipe out 3% debt if they can deploy that same cash into assets compounding at 8% or 10%. They understand opportunity cost. Every dollar used to eliminate cheap debt is a dollar that never got the chance to grow. That matters. Look at home ownership through that lens. For most people, the home is their biggest asset, but they treat it like a piggy bank they're trying to stuff full. Smart money treats it like a bank you can borrow from. As the house appreciates, you can use a home equity line of credit and access that value without selling. Then you can use that borrowed money to buy another asset. Maybe a rental property, maybe a business. Now you're building your own smaller version of buy, borrow, die. You're borrowing against an asset to acquire more assets. That's how wealthy people think. They don't use income to kill debt. They use debt to expand wealth. And yes, that requires a major psychological shift. You have to stop fearing debt blindly and start understanding it. There's bad debt and there's good debt. Bad debt buys things that go down in value. Cars, clothes, vacations, dumb impulses. That kind of debt keeps people broke forever. Good debt buys assets that grow or produce income. Good debt can make you rich. Wealthy people don't usually carry much consumer debt, but investment debt, massive amounts. They use leverage. They control big asset positions with a relatively small amount of their own cash. You can also apply this thinking in your investment account. If you've got a taxable brokerage account, you may be able to borrow against your stocks through margin. Now, this isn't a toy, and it's not for people who don't understand the risks. Margin calls are real. If the market drops hard, the lender can force a sale. So you have to be conservative and smart. But used carefully, it lets you access liquidity without selling and triggering taxes. Instead of dumping stocks for a house, down payment, or an emergency, you borrow against the portfolio. You keep the assets, keep the upside, avoid the tax hit. That's the point. Most people stay trapped because they worship liquidity in the wrong form. They want cash because cash feels accessible. But cash is weak. Cash loses value every year. The wealthy don't hoard cash. They hoard assets. And because they understand how to borrow against those assets, they still get liquidity when they need it. In a modern system, access to credit can be just as powerful as cash in the bank. Except it lets your net worth keep growing while you use it. This brings us to phantom income versus phantom debt. Workers get real income and real taxes. Asset owners get phantom income. Appreciation that grows without being taxed in the moment. The wealthy maximize phantom income. Meanwhile, a lot of middle-class people carry phantom debt. Lifestyle leaks that don't always show up the way a loan does, but drain their money all the same. Car leases, subscriptions, status spending, constant upgrades. You need to reverse that equation. Own assets that grow invisibly and tax efficiently. Eliminate liabilities that bleed you quietly. And we also need to talk about inflation, because this strategy is basically a bet against the currency itself. When you borrow money, you're shorting the dollar. You borrow dollars today that are worth more, and repay them later with dollars that are worth less. If inflation is 3% and your interest rate is 3%, your real borrowing cost is basically zero. That's powerful. The wealthy let inflation erode the value of their debts while their assets inflate upward in price. They win on both sides. The average saver loses on both sides. Their cash gets eaten, and they're not using the kind of good debt that becomes cheaper over time. That's why they feel like they're swimming upstream while rich people look like they're gliding downstream. You have to stop trying to save your way to wealth. In a fiat currency system designed to inflate, that strategy gets weaker every year. You invest your way to wealth. And yes, intelligently used leverage can accelerate it, but don't get stupid with that sentence. Leverage is powerful and dangerous. It cuts both ways. Borrow to buy bad assets and you can destroy yourself. Borrow recklessly and a downturn can wipe you out. That's why wealthy people also obsess over risk management. They diversify, they keep reserves, they don't over-leverage. They use debt like a scalpel, not like a drug. So before you layer on leverage, build a base, emergency fund, stable income, some discipline. Then stop playing it safe and start playing it smart. One practical move you can think about right now is the difference between retirement accounts and taxable brokerage accounts. 401ks and IRAs are fine, useful, but they come with constraints. You can't move as freely. You can't borrow as flexibly. The wealthy often build large taxable brokerage accounts because those accounts give them options. A taxable account works far better with a buy, borrow, die mindset than a retirement account where the government controls the rules. If you're maxing retirement accounts but building zero liquidity in taxable investments, you may be boxing yourself into the system that limits your future flexibility. And then there's tax drag. This matters more than most people realize. Every time taxes take a slice out of your gains, your compounding engine weakens. Lose 30% to taxes over and over across decades, and your final outcome doesn't just shrink by 30%. It can shrink dramatically more because you also lost all the future compounding that money would have produced. Buy, borrow, die is really about removing tax drag. It's about keeping as much of your capital working as possible for as long as possible. That's why it's so powerful. At some point, you also need to change your identity. This part matters. You stop seeing yourself primarily as a worker and start seeing yourself as a capital allocator. A worker tries to increase salary. A capital allocator tries to increase assets. A worker tries to eliminate debt. A capital allocator manages debt strategically. A worker fears the IRS. A capital allocator studies the tax code like a map. That is a different mindset, and that mindset changes outcomes. The system is not suddenly going to become fair because you want it to. The government is not coming to save you from complexity. If you wait for the rules to feel perfect, you'll wait forever. Learn the game as it is actually being played right now, and play to win. The good news, you don't have to be a genius. You need discipline, patience, repetition. That's it. You won't be borrowing against a giant portfolio next month if you've got $500 invested. Fine. Start anyway. Spend the next decade buying assets instead of liabilities, and eventually you hit a crossover point. The moment where your assets start supporting your lifestyle. When that happens, everything changes. You don't need to sell. You don't need to create taxable events. You start stepping into real financial freedom. So don't let fear of debt keep you small. Don't let your obsession with income blind you to the power of assets. Start where you are. Buy your first index fund. Buy your first rental if and when it makes sense. Keep buying. Avoid selling unless you have a damn good reason. And when you need cash, learn how to access it in a way that doesn't immediately hand a gift to the IRS. This is the blueprint, brother. This is how wealthy families keep wealth alive for generations. It's not magic. It's not even really a secret. It's math. And now that you understand the math, you don't get to pretend you don't see the game. Your future self is counting on you to stop working only for money and start making money work for you. The tax code is basically a map of incentives. If you do what the system rewards, invest, build, create businesses, you get treated better. If you only sell labor, you get taxed hard. That's not an opinion. That's structure. So align yourself with the incentives. Stop swimming upstream, bro. Build your arc of assets and let compound interest carry you somewhere most people never reach.